If you liked the video, feel free to subscribe. It would really help the channel, and we have battle reports, boarding actions, and list videos every week. Thanks for watching. Thanks for stopping by. Adeptus Custodes Strengths and Weaknesses. This video will be going over 10 strengths of the Adeptus Custodes faction and 10 of the weaknesses of the faction. Instead of just listing them all off, we'll go in depth in these topics, discuss why and what we can do to take advantage of our strengths, and cover up our weaknesses. With points and rules changes, some of these may not remain for all of 10th. If need be, we can revisit this list in 6 months or so. So let's start on a positive note. Let's look at the strengths of the Adeptus Custodes first. For the 10 strengths of the Adeptus Custodes, we hit very hard in melee, primary scoring, we are a tough army, easy to play, hard to master, we are an elite army, one of the cheapest factions, they are pretty easy to paint, and we do have a codex, Imperial Agent allies, and Imperial Knight allies. We hit very hard in melee. The Adeptus Custodes are primarily a melee army. We do have some range attacks with a few ranged vehicles, but we are mostly a melee infantry army. We have multiple rules that allow us to hit very hard in melee. I play World Eaters too, and I feel the Custodes actually do hit harder in melee. 90% of our infantry has a Guardian Spear, which has 5 attacks, hit on 2+, strength 7, AP 2, damage 2. Most units have around 5 models with those Guardian Spears. The unit will be throwing out 25 attacks. Then Martial Kata, our army rule, gives us sustain hits 1 or lethal hits in melee. The Shield Host Detachment gives us critical hits on 5 or extra AP 1 in melee. Multiple units can access reroll the wound roll, and some detachments have +1 to the wound roll. All of this combined is what makes the Custodes rival any of the melee factions in the game in damage output. Primary scoring. This is one of the greatest strengths of the Custodes. We are very hard to knock off objectives. Our army is on the slow side. Custodes want to march up the board to grab objectives. We need to play safe though. We are not invincible. Leaving our units to weather the storm of enemy firepower will end up in a loss more times than a win. We want to play smart, use our chaff to grab objectives to force the enemy closer to our Custodes infantry unit. Getting on the objectives is half the battle. Using other units to screen or deciding when to be aggressive or less aggressive makes a huge difference. Secondary scoring is one of our weaknesses. Making sure we get as much primary points as possible is part of the game plan. We are a tough army, and what does that mean? Well, with an average of toughness 6 through our units, with a 2-up save and a 4-up invulnerable save through all of our infantry, we can be really hard to kill with small arms fire, or even large damage anti-tank guns if we roll good on our 4+ invulnerable saves. With cover, we can become even harder to kill. AP 1 weapons shooting at Custodes in cover, we will still get our save on 2+, very tanky and very hard to kill with such weapons. Easy to learn, hard to master. I know, the Custodes are an easy faction to learn. For the reason above, we are such a tough army, it is more forgiving for new players, since if you get out of position, the Custodes' high survivability can save new players from losing a lot of models just from learning the game. On the flip side, the higher competition you play against, the harder it is to just lean on being tough. We have a lot less units than most armies, besides knights. Misplaying a unit can lose the game. Losing a unit too early can lose the game as well. We need to know exactly what our units can do to fully utilize them. High-end Custodes is a lot different than casual games with Custodes. Everyone has damage 3 or ways to pick up our units if we make mistakes. We are an elite army, and once again, what does that mean? It means our models are expensive points-wise, but on average, harder to kill with more options for damage output than a non-elite faction. It is good for new players to learn the army as well. With less units on the board, it is less you need to learn. This also can be a weakness depending on the player. I look at it as a strength since I can take my time when I play and not feel rushed at a tournament when deciding what to do with my army. I play with using a timer and I've always had lots of times left just because I don't have as many units to move around. I have more time to think with my army. One of the cheapest to get 2,000 points with. Another strength when we are an elite army is buying the actual army becomes cheaper. We need to own less models than the average faction. For an example, the Space Marine's cheapest 5-man battle line unit is 75 points for the Assault Intercessors, while the Adeptus Custodes 5-man battle line unit is the Custodian Guard, and that is 225 points. You can see how these units can add up to 2,000 points much quicker than the average army, making it overall much cheaper to buy the army. Easy to paint. This is something that brought me to the Custodes. I am a much better painter now, but when I started Warhammer, I was absolutely garbage here. I had never picked up a paintbrush to paint as a hobby ever in my life. The big chunky models that make up the Custodes range were easy for a beginner to paint, while detailed enough that I can enjoy painting them now that I've leveled up my painting skills. The fact that since they are an elite army, I needed even less models to paint, which was a dream come true, because I didn't really enjoy painting at first, so I wanted an army that, hey, I didn't have to paint a lot of models. Easy to paint, and I don't have to paint a mountain of them. And we have a codex. The 10th edition codex is out. It is a bonus for anyone getting in the Adeptus Custodes. You will have 4 detachments to try and play around with. I think around half of the other factions are still waiting for their codex. Playing with one index detachment can get bland while waiting for a codex. Luckily, we have our codex, so we do have 4 different detachments. Imperial Allies. The Adeptus Custodes are an Imperial faction, which means we can take units from the Imperial Agents Codex. This is a great help to the Custodes who lack any lone op units. It also gives us access to a few extra leaders for our battle line unit, the Custodian Guard, such as Inquisitor Draxus, for one of the best combinations we have access to for anti-infantry shooting. The Custodes Assassin adds a lot of secondary scoring options for the Custodes as well. Then we have Imperial Knights, and once again, the Adeptus Custodes being an Imperial faction, they have the option to put Knights in our Custodes lists. They can be a great option for those who do not have that very expensive Caladius Grav Tank. Canis Rex or some Armiger Warglaves can add some reliable anti-tank shooting to our list. We have the Venerable Land Raider, but I would prefer a Warglaive for current 150 points for some anti-tank damage. And that is our 10 strengths. Let's move on to our 10 weaknesses. On to 10 Adeptus Custodes weaknesses. We are slow, we're weak to mortal wounds, our secondary scoring isn't that good, range damage can be lacking, small model range, they're not as tough as they should be right now, game plan can be a bit simple, codex is also a bit bland, lack of good fun strategy support, and Forge World units are so stinking expensive. Let's start off with slow. The Adeptus Custodes are a slow faction. We do have some fast units in the codex, such as the Virtus Praetor's jet bikes, but currently they are one of the worst performing units for the points cost. Generally, we will be marching up our Movement 6 infantry up the board, advancing whenever we are able to get in position, while the Blade Champion character attached to a Custodian Guard or Wardens will have a unit that gives us a once per game advance in charge. With no stratagems in any of the detachments or any other way to get advance in charge other than the Blade Champion, we are generally a slow melee army. Weak to mortal wounds. This can be said about every other army in the game since mortal wounds bypass armor saves. The reason it is so harmful for the Adeptus Custodes is that we rely on our high armor saves to keep our expensive units alive. Our battle line Custodian Guard are 45 points a model. Losing a whole unit to mortal wounds can be a loss of 180 to 225 points, since you can either take a unit of 4 or 5. And this is another reason why the higher we go in competition, the higher skill we need to avoid situations where we can lose hundreds of points per unit lost. Next up is secondary scoring. With our big expensive units, secondary scoring can be a problem. Now this is a weakness that can be fixed with some cheap Psychona units from the Custodes Codex or an Imperial Assassin or 2 as allies. Either way, we do not want to spend a 200 to 400 point unit doing actions while the opponent still has threats left on the board. Opponents will target our secondary scoring units since it is our weakness. Range damage can be lacking. If we do have that Caladius Grav Tank in the list, the range damage is not so much of a problem. It is our infantry units that lack any kind of real threat to high toughness units with an average of strength 4, AP 1, damage 2. It is a credible threat to light infantry, but medium to high toughness units will walk right through our infantry ranged attacks. Small model range. The Adeptus Custodes are one of the newer factions. I believe it was 8th edition when they were released to 40k. Thus, we still do not have a large amount of different units in the Adeptus Custodes Codex. 18 models to be exact, with only 4 kits making the bulk of the units. It does limit the list building options for the Adeptus Custodes. We can use Forge World Custodes units to fill out our list, but Forge World has its own problems. Not as tough as they should be. One of the problems the Codex did bring was the loss of a lot of rules that gave the Adeptus Custodes the ability to withstand some of the higher damage attacks. Now, without some of those rules such as -1 damage, enemy damage 3 weapons pick up entire units of Custodes pretty easily. We don't want them to be invincible meat shields, but they do not feel quite as elite as they should. Our game plan can be simple. Depending on the list, and even then, the game plan of the Adeptus Custodes can be a bit simple. We score a lot of our points from the primary mission. Being on objectives is what we kind of do. We only have 4 to 6 tough Custodes infantry units in our list. A lot of the points in our list will be spent on units to push and hold objectives. And we are slow. It is easy to tell which direction our units are going. We do have access to a few tricksy things, but not as many as other factions. Codex is a bit bland. The Custodes having a more simple game plan comes in large part from the Codex. We do have a small model range, but there is enough units to have some variety in our list. The Codex does have 4 detachments. Sadly, besides the Null Maiden Vigil that revolves around the Psychoni units, the other 3 detachments, the lists are not much different from each other. Even the high-end Custodes list will have multiple units of Wardens, Venatari, or the Grav tanks. I would love to see a detachment around the Alar's Terminators or a detachment for speed, giving more reason to bring our jet bikes. Lack of good/fun stratagem support. The Codex lacks good or fun stratagems that feel fluffy or impactful. Each detachment does have some strong stratagems, even if they are simple like fallback and charge or some sort of shooting support, but other than the one stratagem that allows a reactive 6-inch move, we do not have a lot of options for tricks and sneaky plays. I don't want a bunch of gotchas, just some more ways to do some high-end plays that change the outcome of the game. Then finally, Forge World units. We do have access to another 13 units from the Forge World range, and that is great news. The bad news is that 80% of the units are either side grades to the Codex units, something we don't need, or the worst of all, way overpriced to actually purchase. The Caladius Grav tank is our best range option hands down, while also being one of the most expensive Custodes units. I am in Canada, and before shipping and taxes, it is $201. I have seen entire second-hand armies for that price. The Venatari are another fantastic Forge World unit that is $100 before shipping for 3 models. Custodes can be one of the cheapest to collect, while also being one of the most expensive if you want to build out your collection. And that is the 10 weaknesses. On to some final thoughts. Now for some final thoughts. These, of course, are my personal opinion from playing the Custodes throughout 10th edition. I have been playing them since the start of 10th edition, with 1 or 2 games a week. If you have anything to add to the list, or disagree with anything, throw it in the comments. Let's get the discussion going of what we can do to shore up our weaknesses. We will revisit this video later down the road to see if GW has changed anything for the faction, for the better or for the worse. Thanks for watching, thanks for stopping by.